nice to get to meet all of you. Thank you for coming to this talk. It's really humbling. I'm surprised by how many people are here. That's super cool. So let me introduce myself. My name's Ryan. I'm a lead developer at Guru. It's a Philly-based company, so I'm actually from Philly. This is my first time giving a talk outside of Philadelphia, so I'm really excited to be here. A little nervous, but I'm excited to be here. But I'm really excited to be able to talk about React and hooks, because I work with React every day. I love it, super passionate about it. And I want to see a show of hands. How many people here also work with React, love it? Oh, good amount. Okay, good. How many people are working with more legacy stuff and haven't gotten a chance to really work with hooks? A good amount of people, right? How many people had a reaction similar to me at first when I was like, what the hell is this? All right, cool. All right, that's good. The good crowd to be here. All right, yes, I was like totally confused at first. So I'm going to try and walk you through. I'm going to give you the aha moment that I got, hopefully, by the end of this. And to start doing that, I'm going to do what we do as UI developers, which is build a component. So here's a screen, but we're just going to build this little thing. How many of you have interacted with something like this before? It's like a little chat bubble, gives you messages. This is Intercom, great product. We're going to build it. We're not going to write any JSX or HTML during this presentation. And that's a big part of hooks, is like there's going to be no JSX. We're going to be talking about the state and side effects that it takes to build this thing. So what's the MVP for this? It needs 3 pieces of functionality for me not to get fired. It needs to show your old messages on click. It needs to show a red dot and subscribe to new messages. And it should update the document title if you have new messages and flash that. Like, hey, one new message for you, right? So let's get started. We're going to start with class-based component. So I call it intercom. It extends component. I set up state, messages. It's an array. It makes sense to me. On mount, the very first time that it renders, I call my API, I get my messages, I give the user ID or email or whatever to identify them. And when I get that call back, I set state and I have messages, right? That's the play. We've all probably written code like this a million times, right? This looks super familiar. All right, we're done there. That's one requirement. Super easy. You don't need to write tests or anything, right? So let's talk about the second requirement here. We're going to add new messages. So now I'm going to start highlighting the code so you can actually see the pieces that fit in here. New state key, new messages. We should break the function out to its own function, because normally with event listeners to subscribe and unsubscribe, you need the same function reference. You can't use like anonymous functions and stuff. On mount, at the bottom, we're going to subscribe to new messages and pass in that function. And then when we unmount, we're going to unsubscribe from it, right? Does this make sense? But I want you to notice an effect that's starting to happen here. Imagine coming into this component for the first time and trying to figure out, what the hell does this thing do? Right? Your eye would have to find these 4 key points to kind of paint the whole picture of what's going on. And that's something that as React developers, we don't think about too much, or, I mean, yeah, historically. So let's add the third thing. Here we're going to set an original document title. This is what it was before we started messing with it. And then when the component updates, we'll set the document title if we have new messages in state. To be new messages, otherwise it's going to be the original document title. We'll reset it. But look at the gap here, and you might start thinking like, oh, well maybe if I reorganize it, like component did update could be above, component did mount, and then they're closer together. But that just feels weird, right? Something is a little off here, even though this is the way we've been doing it for a long time. So I love this illustration. This illustration colors pieces of code that are similar. Right? Look at that, though, how scattered they are. This is when a new developer comes into your component because you've been working on it. It's in your brain. It all makes sense. This is how they have to look at it, right? They have to remember key pieces of information. And the more functionality you add, the more cognitive complexity it is. It gets harder, right? And I like things when they're easy. So as code grows, common logic breaks apart. That's just how these components work out. So we know how to componentize UI. You just make a new component. You render it in JSX. But what about behavior? What about state? How do you break that stuff up, right? So to help understand why hooks, we can look at how we did it in the past. And some of you may have used these patterns to organize this kind of stuff, and this is exactly what you were doing. Starting with Mixins. Who remembers Mixins? Okay, this is some old school stuff, but they're actually pretty cool. So the way Mixins work is they're basically an object that has component lifecycle methods in there, and old school ones like getInitialState, which is from like create React class. And then at the bottom here, you can see that we do Mixins, and then we feed it Mixins, and they use that component's this, and they directly set state. But they allow you to kind of abstract this like loading logic into its own thing. So you can see we have 3 mixins: new message mixin, and document title mixin. And right above it is how we would implement new message mixin. So it encapsulates related logic, so that's pretty dope. Well, you could share that. Components could subscribe to these things really easily. But there's namespace collisions. Like if one of those mixins tries to touch the same state value, crazy stuff happens. It's pretty hard to debug. Like, who's updating this? I don't know. It doesn't compose with other mixins, so they both could be touching this, but then they're like tightly coupled. You're not like feeding them like arguments in. And it's difficult to statically analyze because it uses this. So like how many times have you called a function on this that doesn't exist and ESLint didn't tell you, right? Because it doesn't know. It doesn't know what's on there. So it's not easy to do that. Then we moved on to higher order components. So higher order components are basically a function that takes in a component and spits out a brand new one, and normally you spread props and state over it. And since it spits out a brand new component, you just use state, component did mount, component will update, all that stuff. And you can wrap a component in as many of these higher order components as you want. So at the bottom you can see decorated intercom, which is made up of with new messages, with document title. And the idea is that they all add behavior and then they spread props and state over and you just kind of get those as props. So even if you had intercom, you have that base peer component and you could pass in whatever props you want, which is a nice thing to have. So this encapsulates related logic. They can compose together because they just pass props down, right? They're not like touching a this or anything like that. They're just passing in arguments. It's easier to statically analyze because you're getting it from props. But you have questions like, where did these props come from? Like if you log out this.props inside intercom, like where are these coming from? How do I debug this? How do I follow it? Name collisions again because they could pass in the same prop names. Like if new messages and messages both passed in a messages prop, which one would win? It would depend on the order you wrapped it in. And they can still access the component instance, which I think is a big no-no. Then we have render props. This is some of the new hotness that some of you might be familiar with. So the way render props work is you just pass in a function as children, and then the component above you calls that function and gives you the data that you need. So this component, new messages, it actually just renders children but passes in its state, and then you can do whatever you want with that. And at first I hated this. I was like, what's going on here? I don't understand. But I began to fall in love with it. And I used it a lot before hooks. It encapsulated related logic. They composed together pretty well. It was easy to statically analyze, and it was really obvious where the value was coming from, and you could even rename them. Like if you wanted to rename new messages, you destructure it out and you change it. But the problem is the Christmas tree of death. So does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about? Like when I say Christmas tree of death? How many people have gone into a code base and seen this shit show? Yeah, so good luck if you want to get rid of translations or something, because you're going to lose one of those curly braces, and Prettier will not save you. It will not figure it out, and you'll just be adding curly braces and mashing Command-S until it auto-formats. And it's pretty terrible, yeah. But there's something here. Like, even though that's hard to work with and the dev ergonomics aren't good, you're composing a lot of single responsibility things to make a pretty cool piece of code. This is pretty complicated. It fetches data, it has some kind of actions, there's translations there and a theme, but the root of it all, this is the good part right here, right? Like that's what you care about. That's actually what should be getting rendered. So why are all these things components and mucking up the render? So I forget where I heard this quote. I didn't come up with this, so don't attribute it to me. I think I heard Sunil Pai say it. He's a member of the React team. If you want to reinvent the wheel, start with rockets. So like all of those things are pretty similar. Like they use lifecycle methods, state, like they all belong to one component, but maybe something's wrong there from the get-go, right? So what could that be? And that's where hooks come in. So let's talk about useState, which is the first one. So useState is a function. It takes in initial state, and it returns the current state and a function to set it. So every component has a this.state. It also has a this.setState. But imagine instead if you just called a function and it provided those for you. So a component could have n number of set states, an n number of states. They no longer have to be an object. So now you can split it up into multiple states if you'd like to, right? And that benefit might not be super obvious at first, but stick with me here. Second one, useEffect. This one is probably one of the more complicated ones for people to wrap their heads around. I hear it described as like, it's all the component life cycles in one, man. But it's a bit different than that. So the way useEffect works here is it takes in a function, and that's the effect. And every time you render, it's going to run that effect. So like if every time you rendered you wanted to console log something, you'd pass in a function that console logged. Then you can optionally return a function, and that's the cleanup, right? So say your effect is that you add a click listener to the document, but when you unmount you want to clean it up, then you return a function that cleans up that event listener. And the way that it works is the very first time something renders, it fires the effect. Then on the next render, it fires the cleanup and then the effect again. So it's constantly like doing an effect, then cleaning up, doing an effect, cleaning up, until it unmounts and it cleans up totally. So it ends up working out. And this is the way now that we're supposed to be doing stuff like fetching data or any side effects at all. That includes like console logging. That's mostly what I do, is just like data fetching and console logging, and like setting the document title, for example. So this code sample actually shows how you could implement all three of those requirements. But I'm not going to step through those right now. I'm actually just going to focus on one. So let's go back to the previous example of how we did new messages. It looked like this, right? And imagine scanning this, trying to figure out what's going on. So let's look at the hooks implementation. And I think that's pretty powerful, right? If you were writing this code, it's a lot easier to come into something and think about it. Like, what does this thing do? Would you rather see this, or would you rather see this, right? They're all in tight little boxes, so it's like one thing after the other. And that's where the power of being able to have lifecycle hooks and state decoupled from the component really shine through. We haven't talked about JSX at all this talk. It's all been focused on state and effects. They're powerful on their own, and they deserve the ability to be encapsulated. The craziest thing, though, is that you can just throw these hooks in a function and call them use something. So now we have use new messages. Those three code blocks from before, just slap them in their own functions if you want to. You could put them in the same file. Use new messages takes an ID, subscribes, and then gives you new messages. Use messages, give it an ID, it fetches the messages and gives you those messages. Use temporary document title. You give it what you want the temporary title to be. If you don't give it anything, it uses the original one. You don't even need to worry about it. At the end of the day, this is what the final component looks like. Now, imagine being a new developer at a company. Wouldn't you really like to walk into my component that looks like this? It almost looks like we're cheating, right? Like we're just saying like, oh, use messages, use new messages, use temporary document title. And it's really nice. It ends up working really great. So I talked about useState, useEffect. So the main thing when I say why do people want to use hooks, it's for co-location, it's for encapsulation. This is something that you couldn't do without hooks, right? The ability to make these functions and share them with the world. You could publish them as NPM modules if you want to. And here's some examples of some custom hooks that I've used. So ones like use network status. So you just call this function and it tells you if the user's on 2G, 3G, or LTE. Super good if you want an accessible app in a country where they may have limited internet and you want to serve them different content. Use memory status. This one's pretty wild, but it just tells you if the phone is like low on memory. So like, don't show them that huge video, give them a picture. Use online to see if they're offline or online, so you could gray out the screen and be like trying to reconnect. Use interval. So this is one that Dan actually made, a member of the React team, because there's a lot of gotchas that can be got with set interval and trying to set state when a component unmounts and having to clean all that up. So it's just really declarative, easy way to use set interval in a component, and it just automatically catches all those problems. And there's tons of them. Like maybe that's my biggest concern with hooks, is that people just went wild when they saw hooks, because it's hard to figure out when should something be a hook, when shouldn't it be a hook. So there's just like, if you go to this link, there's like thousands of them, and they all do crazy stuff. All right, everyone with me so far? We're feeling good? Okay, good. And now I'm gonna talk about a couple other ones. So we have useState, useEffect. Those are like the two most common ones. useRef. This one is super similar to useState. You can mutate it directly, and it doesn't cause a re-render. So you might be like, when would I want to use that over useState? It's important if you want to keep a value, but you don't, like the render doesn't necessarily depend on it. So this example is maybe when you get a user ID, if you've already fetched their messages, you don't want to do it again. Like if you're just constantly flicking back and forth and you'd rather cache it. So you can set up a ref that has all of the IDs you've previously gotten, and you don't fetch them again. You don't want to cause a re-render though, right? You just want to store some information and have it be cleaned up when the component unmounts, because maybe you want the cache to reset, and that's what this is super useful for. And that's a time that you may want to use it. useReducer. This one normally throws some people for a loop. How many people here are familiar with Redux and the reducer pattern? How many people know that you can use reducers outside of Redux? Yeah. Because they're just functions that take an input and give you an output. It's literally just a switch case. And they're super useful all the time. It's really nice to dispatch actions. So basically what React said was, hey, you want a simpler way to work with state? Instead of calling set state, we'll give you a dispatch. You give us a reducer, and we'll figure it out. This hook is really useful when you have related state. So like if you're writing a component and you find that when you set state, you end up setting like 2 keys at the same time, just call that an action, like delete to do or add to do, or dispatch that and update it all at once and keep it in one central place, and it's easier to trace down. A lot of people default actually to using useReducer, but I actually think useState is nice because it's easier to use and gets people into it, and I think that's important. useContext. So the new context API uses render props, so you can enter the Christmas tree of hell, right? So you have context.provider and a context.consumer, and you have to do those render props. This just gives you a really easy way to consume all of those contexts at the top. So if I went all the way back to that Christmas tree, here I get auth theme and locale, and there's no nesting, right? So all the goodness is still being returned, but you don't have to worry about the crazy render props and like what's actually putting HTML on the screen, what's not. It's just a really nice way to clean things up. useMemo. This one's pretty interesting. So useMemo is for expensive computations on render. So like, for example, the Fibonacci sequence is like, you can do it really poorly. Like this, I would fail a programming interview. Just slowly get that number. But say that you only want to calculate it once and then cache that, just like memoize a function. This gives you a super easy way to memoize values. And all of these things you might be like, wait, why are these hooks? Why aren't these just like functions that I make that memoize values? They all hook into React internals, right? So like when this component unmounts, it's going to clean up the memoize cache, which you could do using component unmount and stuff like that. But that's what all of these do for you. They have some kind of state that's based on the lifecycle of the component itself. So useMemo, as long as the thing is rendered, it will try to memoize these things. It's not guaranteed, but it will try for performance reasons. And it actually speeds up subsequent renders by a lot, depending on what you're doing. useCallback. Yeah, so I'm going through a lot here. There's quite a few. You'll probably only end up using useState and useEffect, but it's good to know about these ones. useCallback, so how many people pass in anonymous functions as props? A good amount, yeah? You probably hear that like it's bad for performance. It's not that bad, really. It's fun to do. But like if you do have a very expensive component and you know that you need to optimize it and you want to do like a should component update to check if things have actually changed in the props, you can use callback and you can just memoize that function and pass it in. So that way when it re-renders, it'll see like, oh, this is the same. You could also declare it outside of the function, or outside of the component, but if you do that, then you don't have direct access to the stop props and stuff, so it's up to you. There's a couple different ways to skin this, but it's just a general utility that does this kind of memoization for you. And so Tyler McGinnis did this tweet, which is awesome because it basically sums up my whole talk in like 140 characters. And I really love it, so I included it here because this is just the general gist of all these things. I think this is like one of the toughest things with hooks is just kind of learning all these things and like why would you use them. But if at the end of this talk you take away a basic understanding of why useState and useEffect are awesome and you Google these and use them when you need to, that would make me very happy. So now I want to do a quick peek into the future. These are experimental, so don't snitch on me because I don't want to go to React jail. So please don't go tweeting that these are out and awesome. These may change, right? How many people here have heard of concurrent mode? Concurrent mode, okay. All right, so I'll explain concurrent mode a little bit. The way, so Git, everybody here has a pretty decent understanding of Git, I'm gonna make the assumption. Imagine if when you're working on code you didn't have Git. So like you go to change files and you have to like make sure with your coworker like, hey, nobody's in this controller, right? Because I'm gonna change it. That's kind of how React's rendering works right now. So like if you give it a big tree, it will start rendering that thing in memory and trying to put things into the DOM, but it can't stop. Like once it gets started, it can't stop. So imagine typing into a search and it's really laggy because you get 1,000,000 results and you try to solve it in a bunch of different ways. But once React starts rendering that list, it's not gonna stop. It's just gonna keep going. So concurrent mode is a big rewrite that allows you to basically say, hey, hold up. Like this is my branch. Like think of it like a branch in Git. I'll come back to this and when I'm done, I'll commit it and that's when I put it on the screen, right? So if a user is typing into an input, you may want to say, render when you get the chance, like commit when you get the chance that list, but it's more important that the input's updating, because then it feels buttery smooth and people are like, wow, this is really performant. When in reality, you're just shifting work around because everything's single-threaded, right? So these hooks that are coming up are all ways to interact with concurrent mode and make experiences really great for people of all different kinds of, it's accessible to people with different network capabilities. And it lets you make these cool experiences. So the first one here is useTransition. So I use GIFs for these at first instead of code blocks because it's a bit easier to get. So when you start a transition, React starts working on rendering the update. So like when you click that next button, it makes an async call to get a random person. But it leaves the DOM totally alone. So it like, imagine another dimension where it starts doing this rendering work, and it just leaves the screen as it is. It doesn't do any updates. It doesn't change anything. And you can set a threshold. So like if something takes longer than 3 seconds, you can let it transition into the loading state. But if something only takes like less than a second, do you really want to show a loading state that blips? Like, has anyone ever had that problem where they're like, don't show the loading state if, well, this just makes it super simple because you just say, well, a second, and then it will do that for you. No like crazy hacking anymore, right? It gives you, if we go to what the code looks like, so we set up some state here, and then we use transition, which gives you a function called start transition and is pending. So it's useful to know, like, hey, there is a transition happening, because maybe, like in this example, you see when they click the button, it says fetching there, but it doesn't go to loading. That's useful because maybe you want to show a little button loading indicator or something like that. So it gives you the is pending flag and a function that called start transition that lets you begin the transition. And then you can give it a timeout and like, hey, this is how long I want you to stay frozen, but then I want you to show the loading indicator. And then our button here on click calls start transition and passes in a function. And this is like where every set state that's done in there, it won't do anything until the transition is done. So it won't do any state updates, it won't move along. And this is pretty big because it lets you have adaptable experiences, similar to being like, hey, I don't want to show a loading indicator for a second. The second one is called useDeferredValue. So when I was talking before about doing the input, like typing into the input and rendering the list, people here are probably familiar with like using debounce or something, right? So like you'll have 2 state objects. One's like input and the other one will be like search input or something. And then you'll just debounce that. The problem with debouncing and throttling and everything is that it's difficult to be adaptive. So like if someone has slow memory or slow internet, one strategy may be better than the other. So that's like a huge part of what React is trying to abstract from you, is they're doing like stuff based off heuristics like what they should do. So this is a helper function that lets you make a deferred value, which is basically that second state key, but you don't have to worry about the debouncing or anything, right? It's just going to remember what the past proper state value was, and then after a certain timeout, it'll update. So in this GIF, you can see that when you click next, it will load the name immediately, but there's a bit of a delay where the text doesn't change. And that's because that value is deferred. So imagine if that's a list of like 1 million items. You just say, I want it to be deferred until the browser can paint and not lag, right? Like that's literally what you want to say. Like, hey, just make this thing when it's performant. And that one looks like this, where you just kind of pass it a value and then a timeout, and then it will wrap it, and it's just really magical. It just does it all for you. And you can do stuff like compare it to the actual resource to see if it's stale. Like that's how I made the text a little bit opaque. Yeah. Very cool. And that's it for the talk, pretty much. Went through things pretty quick, but I'd love to take some questions right now. I know that was a lot. I'll go back through slides, depending on how people are feeling, so. Okay, I'll start with you. I saw your hand up first. Oh, the newer ones, what the timeline for that is? I don't. So the question was, what's the timeline for the newer hooks to be coming out? So I can tell you that suspense is out for, so concurrent mode suspense is like the ability to render something while work is being done in that other dimension. They did that for lazy loading components already. So like you could lazy load a component and use suspense and like just wait and show like the old DOM tree and then something will come in later. So that exists already, but they've been working through these things for quite a bit because they're trying to get it right. They had another implementation that didn't work out with Relay and the rest of the Facebook ecosystem. So the real answer is they'll come out when they're ready, and that's not really a great answer, but that's the truth. Yeah, there's been no like timeline on that that's been given.
Can you talk about when you transitioned over from thinking hooks were crazy to liking hooks?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the question is, can I talk about when I started to like hooks. Like I thought they were, well, anytime I see a new technology, I'm just kind of burned out from like technology churn. I always try to look at it in terms of like, what's the value that this thing's gonna bring? Because the sad fact with technologies, I feel like all of it's marketing because it's all products. So like when something like hooks comes out, or you talk about like Ivy for Angular, like I don't know like what the benefits of that. I'm just skeptical at first, right? Like I want to see what it is. So the big click moment for me was actually Dan gave a talk at an EU conference where he kind of showed like exactly what I did. And there was like a huge moment for me when I saw the slide where the code was highlighted together as opposed to being separate, because I had never thought about that, right? Like when I'm writing the components, I just wrote it out and I was like, yeah, it makes sense because you know where component did update is and component did mount is. But after I saw what it did to my code, that's what's really cool about hooks, is that they put you in the pit of success. Like it's really easy to come out with something that makes sense at the end of it when you're using it. Versus with lifecycle hooks, there's nuance there that you have to be a bit more senior to make it all make sense, and you feel like the tool is making you bend over backwards to make it make sense. Where I feel like hooks makes you write stuff that makes sense just naturally because of the way they work out, right? Like you could put everything in one object and just have a state in one object, just old school. But you always have the option of splitting it up now with hooks. But previously you never had that option, so you had to do like other things to make that work out. Oh, okay. That's a great question. I feel like that's something that people are confused about, like Redux, how does that fit in with hooks? Ken C. Dodds wrote a great article on state management, so I'm going to try my best to kind of sum that up. So you can use hooks. I kind of think of it like a gradient. So like I almost always start by keeping components in the same file, using state, and then as things get more complicated, I elevate it to like useReducer, to context. And then I think that things do belong in global state. Like that does make sense. Some people are like everything in global state, which I think has specific trade-offs. But I think that hooks just fill a different space. Like when we're talking about hooks, we're still just talking about local state. And we're still just talking about, so it's the same discussion we've always been having of like local state versus Redux. And I believe each one has trade-offs, and some make sense when others don't. The one thing though, if you are like, yo, I'm dumping Redux, I'm going straight to context, if you have an app that relies a lot on performance with updates, you will get bit, because Redux tried to switch over to context, and there's no way for them to, like once you update context, you're re-rendering. You have no choice. So like in Redux, when you compute props from the store, you give Redux a chance to like be like, okay, nothing changed based off computed values, but you can't do that with context. There was like an API that was suggested, but it kind of just fell apart, and Redux had to move away from it. So that is something to consider. But that's not every app, right? So there are definitely trade-offs there. I would not say you should just stick with one and, yeah, try everything. Okay.
Can you go back to useState?
Yeah.
Just make sure I understand that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is it setting messages and set messages in as an array in state?
Yeah, so the main idea is that when you first call this function, because these are stateful functions, this is why it's weird in JavaScript. Like it's weird to think that functions could hold on to like some kind of state. But the main idea is the first time you ever call useState, it'll recognize it's the first time you call it, and the argument that you give it, that's what it's going to set the state to. Every time you re-render, you're going to recall this function, and it's going to go, oh, this was the second time I was called. So instead of using your initial state, I'm going to give you whatever you set previously, right? So it actually changes depending on how many times you've called it. And then it just gives you what the current state is and a function that lets you update it. And when you call that function, it's just going to tell React to re-render. That's really all that it does.
So is it setting messages and set messages to an empty array?
No, you can pass it whatever you want. You could pass it an object there. You could pass it a Boolean. Like it will just, picture it as a box, and when you call that function, whatever you give it, it's just going to put it in that box.
But I mean, what's shown there is setting it to an empty array.
That's the initial state. Yeah, so like when you first call it, like, you know, here, I'll show you here. Let me see if I can find it. So here you see when new messages up here is an array. That's what it's going to be initially. So it's the same thing. Like whatever you pass that in the first time, it's going to do effectively this. And then any time that you call the set function, you can set it to be whatever you want it to be. Be an object, Boolean, probably going to be an array. So these are actually these functions right here. So like before, when I showed these 3 code blocks, these don't have to be in React components. These could be in their own functions, right? So like that's something that's really odd. But you could have like useState and another hook, which is what I did here. So I literally just copy pasted those 3 blocks and then gave them semantic names. And then you can consume those, and what about it is React will dig into use messages, and then it will see the hooks that are called in use messages, and then it basically spreads those out. Like it runs those in order. So it's as if the component itself was calling useState and useEffect. So it just allows you to encapsulate lifecycle methods in these little functions. And that's what allows you to have like magical stuff like this, where it just seems like you're writing plain English. But at some point you do have to use useState and useEffect, because that's where everything cool happens. But at least you can abstract them.
Is there anything that, is it just the word, the use of use in front of it that makes a custom hook?
So you don't need to use in front, but you should, because that's how the ESLint rules work. They have like a whole package for that. So it's kind of like semantically what they do. It's not my favorite thing, but as long as you're using the React like ones they export, useState, useEffect, any function that those are inside of, they're considered hooks. It's a hook. Okay. Any other questions? Alrighty. Then that's my talk. Thank you very much for coming out.